I've gone back and forth on whether to post this. Most people who confess online either want forgiveness or attention. I don't think I deserve the first, and I'm too old to care about the second. What I want is to finally tell the story the way it actually happened, not the version the newspapers guessed it, not the rumors that spread around town years later. This happened more than a decade ago. Back then, I convinced myself I wasn't a violent man. I wasn't looking to hurt anyone. I just wanted money badly enough to believe that one carefully planned theft would solve everything. Gambling debts, overdue bills, a business that had quietly collapsed while I kept pretending everything was fine. I had buried myself so deep that crime started looking less like a choice and more like an exit. That's the lie people tell themselves. You don't wake up one morning and decide to become a criminal. At least I didn't. It happened one compromise at a time. A fake excuse here. A forged signature there. Then one day I found myself studying the routines of someone who trusted me, calculating how long they'd be away from their office and what security systems they actually used instead of the ones they bragged about. I thought I had planned for every camera, every lock, every witness. What I never planned for was something so small that I barely noticed losing it. A cheap brass token. It had no real value. You couldn't even buy anything with it anymore. I'd carried it in my pocket for years out of habit after getting it from an old arcade that had closed down. It was scratched, faded, and practically worthless. By the time I realized it was gone, it had already become the single most important piece of evidence in the entire investigation. And everything that followed started with that tiny mistake. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment I crossed the line. It wasn't when I broke a law. It was when I stopped asking myself whether I should and started asking only whether I could. A year before everything fell apart, my construction business was barely hanging on. Contracts disappeared, suppliers demanded payment, and every phone call felt like another reminder that I was drowning. I borrowed money to keep the company alive, then borrowed more to cover the first loans. Eventually, I owed people who weren't interested in excuses. They wanted cash, and they wanted it fast. That's when I started paying attention to Victor, an antique dealer I'd known for years. He trusted me enough to let me into his office whenever I stopped by. He often bragged about private collectors paying in cash, and I noticed he sometimes kept large amounts in a safe overnight before depositing them. The thought arrived quietly: one theft, no one gets hurt, debts disappear. It sounded logical then. That's the dangerous thing about desperation, it disguises terrible ideas as practical solutions. Once I accepted that thought, I stopped being a struggling businessman and became someone planning a crime, even if I refused to admit it to myself. Once I convinced myself I was actually going through with it, planning became an obsession. I treated it like another construction project, breaking everything into small tasks instead of thinking about the bigger picture. That made it feel less like a crime and more like a complicated job. I never intended to improvise. For nearly 3 weeks, I watched Victor's routine without making it obvious. I knew what time he unlocked the shop, when he usually stepped out for coffee, and which evenings he stayed late to sort new inventory. I even walked around the block at different hours to see how much foot traffic there was and whether anyone paid attention to parked cars. The biggest surprise was how ordinary everything looked. There were no laser alarms or security guards, just predictable habits. People trust routines far more than locks. I bought a pair of plain gloves, borrowed an old jacket no one would recognize, and left my phone at home so it couldn't place me near the shop. Every precaution made me feel smarter, calmer, almost untouchable. What I didn't realize was that you can spend weeks planning around the obvious risks while completely overlooking the smallest, most insignificant thing in your pocket. The night I chose felt almost too perfect. Rain had started just after sunset, leaving the streets quiet and empty. Most people hurried indoors instead of lingering outside, which was exactly what I had hoped for. I parked a few blocks away, pulled on my gloves, and walked the rest of the distance, trying to look like someone simply heading home. Getting inside was easier than I expected. Earlier that week, I had quietly copied the office key while helping Victor move a display cabinet. He never suspected a thing. The lock clicked open, and for a brief moment I actually smiled. Months of stress seemed to disappear as I stepped into the dark office. I worked quickly, using a small flashlight covered with tape to dim the beam. I avoided touching anything unnecessary and headed straight for the safe. Just as Victor had once carelessly mentioned, the combination hadn't changed in years. When the safe door swung open, my heart pounded so hard I could hear it. The cash was there exactly where I expected it to be. For one reckless minute, I truly believed I had beaten the system. I had just finished stuffing the cash into my backpack when I heard a sound that made my stomach drop. It wasn't an alarm or a police siren. It was the front door opening. At first, I froze. My brain refused to process what I was hearing. Victor wasn't supposed to be there. I'd built my entire plan around his schedule, and according to that schedule, he should have been across town having dinner with his sister. Then I heard voices. Victor had returned with a customer who wanted to look at an antique clock before leaving for a business trip the next morning. Apparently, the sale couldn't wait. I killed my flashlight and crouched behind a storage shelf, barely breathing. The office was separated from the showroom by a thin wall, and every word carried through it. They laughed, chatted about prices, and wandered around far longer than I expected. Every passing minute made escape more difficult. My legs cramped, sweat soaked through my shirt, and I became painfully aware that fear has its own sound, a heartbeat so loud you start believing everyone else can hear it too. I kept telling myself to stay calm. That was when I made the first real mistake. After what felt like an hour, Victor finally locked the front door again. I waited several more minutes just to be safe. My legs were stiff, my hands were shaking, and all I wanted was to get out before something else went wrong. I slipped out of the office as quietly as I had entered. The rain had stopped, leaving the sidewalk slick and reflecting the streetlights. I remember thinking how normal everything looked. Cars passed by, a couple walked their dog across the street, and nobody paid any attention to me. It almost felt unreal. I reached my car, tossed the backpack onto the passenger seat, and drove home using side streets instead of the main road. Every mile put a little more distance between me and the shop, and with that distance came confidence. I even caught myself smiling. When I emptied my pockets at home, I noticed my keys, my wallet, and a few coins. Something was missing. I patted every pocket again, checked the car floor, searched the backpack, and even retraced my steps in my mind. The old brass arcade token was gone. I laughed at first. It seemed completely meaningless. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the token lying on Victor's office floor, tucked beneath a desk or glinting under a cabinet. I kept arguing with myself that it didn't matter. It was just an old arcade token with no name, no fingerprints worth finding because I'd worn gloves, and nothing to connect it directly to me. By sunrise, I had convinced myself of something even more dangerous. I should go back and find it. It sounds ridiculous now, but panic doesn't produce rational decisions. It narrows your world until one tiny problem feels bigger than the crime itself. I waited until late afternoon, put on different clothes, and walked past the shop pretending to browse nearby stores. Police tape wasn't there yet, but Victor stood outside talking to two officers. They were pointing toward the entrance while another detective photographed the office inside. The token was still somewhere in that building. I could feel it. As I watched from across the street, Victor suddenly bent down, picked up something from the floor near the doorway, and held it in the palm of his hand. Even from that distance, I recognized the dull brass color. My heart stopped. At first, I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Plenty of old coins and tokens look alike. Maybe Victor had picked up a washer, or a foreign coin, or some random piece of metal that had been there for years. I clung to those possibilities because the alternative was unbearable. Then one of the detectives took the token from Victor and sealed it inside a small evidence bag. That was the moment I realized it wasn't being ignored. It mattered. I left before anyone could notice me staring, but my mind wouldn't slow down. I kept replaying every second I had spent inside the office. I hadn't dropped my wallet. I hadn't left fingerprints. I hadn't been seen by any witnesses. Yet somehow, the only personal item I'd carried for years had ended up at the scene. Over the next few days, I learned something I hadn't expected. Victor mentioned to several people that the strange brass token definitely hadn't belonged in his office. It was unusual enough that everyone remembered seeing it. What should have been meaningless suddenly became the first real thread investigators started pulling. For the first week, nothing happened. No police knocked on my door, no dramatic arrests, no frantic phone calls. On the surface, life looked exactly the same. I went to work, paid bills, and even met a friend for coffee. I smiled when people expected me to smile. Inside, though, I was falling apart. Every conversation about the burglary made my pulse race. People at the hardware store talked about how bold the thief must have been. Someone mentioned that the police had a strange piece of evidence they couldn't explain yet. I pretended to be curious, asking casual questions while desperately hoping no one noticed how interested I sounded. Then Detective Harris came to see me. He wasn't accusing me of anything. He simply said he was speaking with everyone who knew Victor well. We sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee while he asked ordinary questions about Victor's habits, his business, and whether I'd seen anything unusual recently. I answered every question smoothly. Too smoothly. Looking back, I realize innocent people don't rehearse conversations in their heads dozens of times beforehand. Criminals do. And experienced detectives notice the difference long before they have enough evidence to prove it. A few days after Detective Harris visited, he called and asked if I could stop by the station. He said they had a couple of follow-up questions for people who knew Victor. His tone was calm, almost friendly, which somehow made me even more nervous. The interview started the same way as before. We talked about Victor's business, his customers, and whether anyone had seemed suspicious lately. Then Harris reached into a folder and placed a clear evidence bag on the table. Inside was the brass token. I recognized every scratch on it before he even asked the question. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" My mouth went dry. I forced myself to shrug and said it looked familiar, maybe something from an old arcade. That part wasn't a lie. The lie was pretending it meant nothing to me. Harris watched my face for a few seconds longer than was comfortable. He didn't argue or accuse me. He simply nodded, put the token away, and moved on. I left believing I'd survived another close call. What I didn't know was that they hadn't shown me the token to identify it. They wanted to see if it would identify me. After that interview, I became obsessed with staying one step ahead. I deleted old messages, threw away the clothes I'd worn that night, and even sold the car I'd driven, convincing myself that removing every possible connection would keep me safe. Each little action felt like taking control, but in reality I was only feeding my paranoia. Then Victor called me. He sounded exhausted, not angry. He said the police had asked whether anyone he knew collected old arcade memorabilia or carried unusual tokens. He laughed awkwardly and said it was the strangest question he'd ever been asked. I forced myself to laugh too, but my chest tightened. That conversation haunted me for days. The investigators hadn't found the token because it was valuable. They were trying to find out who would recognize it, who had been seen carrying something like it, and who had a reason to be near Victor's office. My careful plan had accounted for cameras, fingerprints, and witnesses. It never accounted for memory. People remembered insignificant things far better than I ever imagined. And once those memories started connecting, every lie I'd told became harder to keep straight. About 3 weeks after the burglary, there was a knock at my front door just after 7 in the morning. The kind of knock that's calm, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. I looked through the window and saw Detective Harris standing there with another officer. I already knew. There was no dramatic chase, no attempt to run. The truth was, I'd been expecting that knock every day. In a strange way, the waiting had been worse than what came next. Harris asked if they could come inside. He explained they had gathered additional evidence and wanted to ask a few final questions. This time, he didn't dance around the subject. He laid out a timeline of my movements, witness statements, and security footage showing my car near the neighborhood earlier that evening. Then he mentioned the token. Not because it had my name on it. Because several people, including Victor, remembered seeing me absent-mindedly flipping that exact brass token through my fingers whenever we talked. It had become part of my identity without me realizing it. I finally understood the cruel irony. The smallest thing I'd owned had made me unforgettable. People imagine that getting caught is the worst part. For me, it wasn't. The worst part was finally running out of lies. Once I admitted what I'd done, there was an odd sense of relief mixed with overwhelming shame. I no longer had to invent excuses or replay every conversation in my head, wondering whether I'd slipped up. But that relief came at a cost. I had to face Victor not as a friend or a business acquaintance, but as the man who had betrayed his trust. He never yelled at me. Somehow, that hurt more. He simply asked why I hadn't come to him for help. I didn't have a good answer. Pride, fear, desperation, they all sounded hollow when spoken aloud. Sitting alone afterward, I realized I'd spent months convincing myself I was stealing from someone who could afford the loss. That was another lie. I hadn't just taken money. I had taken someone's sense of security and trust. The guilt didn't arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, quietly, and never really left. I accepted a plea deal and served my sentence. It wasn't as long as it could have been because I confessed, returned what was left of the money, and cooperated with the investigation. None of that erased what I'd done, but it was the first honest decision I'd made in a long time. Prison gave me something I hadn't expected: time. Time to replay every choice that led me there. I used to blame the economy, my debts, bad luck, even other people. Eventually, those excuses stopped working. Plenty of people lose businesses without deciding to rob someone they know. When I was released, rebuilding my life was harder than serving my sentence. Employers saw my record before they saw me. Old friends kept their distance. Some never spoke to me again, and I couldn't blame them. Oddly enough, I still think about that brass token more than the money. The cash disappeared almost as quickly as it came. The token lasted forever because it represented the moment my carefully constructed illusion collapsed under the weight of one careless mistake. If you've read this far, you're probably expecting some dramatic ending or a clever lesson about crime. There isn't one. My story ends the way most real ones do, with consequences that linger far longer than the crime itself. People sometimes ask whether I regret dropping the token. They're asking the wrong question. I don't regret losing it. I regret everything that made me carry it into that office in the first place. If the token hadn't exposed me, something else eventually would have. You can't build a life on deception without the cracks showing. The biggest lie I ever believed was that I could control the outcome. I thought careful planning guaranteed success. In reality, no plan survives your own humanity. You forget things. You panic. You make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes are so small they seem impossible to matter until they're the only thing anyone remembers. So here's my advice. If desperation ever convinces you that one crime will solve all your problems, walk away. Ask for help. Admit you're struggling. Pride is far less expensive than guilt, and the hardest truth to live with is knowing you created your own downfall.